everyone. Old Republic Title Company, for those who are new here. I have Nicole Cisneros, one of our escrow officers in our office, and Kristen Garcia, who just stepped to get some water. They're both a team and they work off of the Mason office here in Vacaville. Today we're going to be talking about assumable loans just because we have been seeing those come up more frequently, and they're going to give you all the knowledge about it. And then anyone on Zoomland, if you guys have any questions, please let us know, drop it in the chat. And then this is going to be Q&A style. So if you guys have any questions yourselves, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll just talk about it. Kristen and Nicole will first do an intro, just kind of to let you guys know what exactly are assumable loans if you need a refresher or you just don't know what it is exactly. And today we have Bree Milani with First American Home Warranty, and I'm just going to have her come up here and chat a little bit with you guys, and then Nicole and Kristen will take over.
Well, thank you for having me. I know some people get confused, and I think last time we were here, they said I was Old Republic Home Warranty, but I'm not. First American. And I know it's confusing. We're just very close, so we obviously get to work together, which is awesome. And I get to work with these ladies too, which is great. So yes, I'm the local rep here in Vacaville. And I've been with First American about 2.5 years. And I also do JCP NHD. So if you have any NHD needs or questions, let me know. NHD is kind of, I don't say boring, but it kind of doesn't steal the show like home warranty like consumes my entire life. So I tend to talk about that more than anything. So it's number one, the most important thing is having a local rep is huge for your clients. For if you have questions about making an offer and you have questions on our coverage, just being able to call somebody and say, hey, here's what we're looking at. I need some help on this. Can you guide my clients to what we need? And with summer around the corner means we're probably going to have some claims that happen because that's what we're here for, right? To make those claims if, God forbid, the HVAC goes out, which is my whole life from starting now till September is just, I've learned way more about air conditioning than I ever hoped I'd ever know. Oh gosh, here we go. But yes, that's what I'm here for, to lean on me and make sure that if your clients are having issues with First American on anything, just call me. Well, not title, because I can't help you on that. Just on home warranty, call me. I can't stress it enough. The last thing I want is for your client to be in the weeds of a claim and me get it a month later after they've already been going through it for a month. So have them place the claim. If there's any issues, give me a call. One thing I'm going to talk about super quick is our HVAC upgrade. It's called Codes, Mods, and More. So if you're getting into escrow, the inspection saying, hey, look, the HVAC is working, it's just past its life expectancy, put a little asterisk in your mind that you want to put on. It's called Codes, Mods, and More. It's the best upgrade we have, the most bang for your buck as far as it goes with the HVAC. So keep that in mind. You know, we are coming into summer months and that will come into a lot of help. Basically what it does is it gives your client an extra $1,000 that we will pay for out-of-pocket expenses if anything were to go wrong with the HVAC unit. So huge benefit. And on top of that, it also does the same thing for the water heater, and it's all in one coverage. So sorry, I talk fast. So if you have questions, let me know, text me, call me, whatever you need to do. I'm happy to help. And thank you for having me. You're the best.
Thank you for being here.
When there's so much food, like way too much food, so eat up.
Thank you, Brady. Thank you for bringing the goodies for us too. And thank you all for taking time out of your day. Nicole and I, as you know, if you've worked with us, are a team. So we come together today to present this. So assumptions are something that have actually always been a possibility. The VA or FHA with their approval have always been something that's out there. And it's more so right now because of the climate that we're in, where some things change. And the reason for this being a benefit to the buyer is that the interest rates are so low on those loans because of about 3 years ago, or VA loans just in general. So with that being said, has anyone had any experience with an assumption before? Have you been a listing agent where it was perhaps an option? No. Okay. So one thing that if you are taking a listing and that is an option, I would always advise you to talk about what type of a timeline does your seller have to get out of there, because these are not quick. Your contract dictating 30, 60, 90 days is not probably going to be, it's going to be a moving target, I would say. The lenders that'll tell you that they'll get it done in 30 days, truth be told, they're telling stories. Yeah. We've not closed one, I think less than
60, I think, is our fastest, but we've had ones that went like 9
9
months. Yeah,
9 months.
I want to say average is probably 3-4 months is probably average, but so many people we feel have gotten into contract and are like, don't worry, we're gonna close this in 30 days. Our assumption contact said it would be 30 days. We have yet to have a 30-day assumption close.
Why do you think it took you so long?
I think it just has to go through so many channels and it doesn't have the same urgency of like when you have our local loan officers, you know, pushing forward a loan and pushing it. You don't have really that broker that's kind of in the middle pushing it along. So we've just noticed it's like everyone kind of has to be involved on these. Buyers have to continue to call, sellers have to continue to call, just to kind of hold these assumption departments accountable to keep moving. Yeah.
Is it any one like certain bank, like UWM versus? No. It's all the
No,
same?
I feel like the one that took longest was that buyer was already living there. The seller was deployed. So I think in that situation, the urgency might not have been there where they were calling all the time, saying like, where are we at? What do you need? But I want to say average though, like 3 to 4 months, but it's just a lot of checking in with them. It's constant, like you have to make sure if you have clients, either as a seller or the buyer, that they're willing to basically take the time to do lots of phone calls. And did you have a question?
Yeah, how do you know when the loan is assumable?
Okay.
Are they all?
Go ahead, Chris.
So pretty much any FHA or VA loan is assumable with the VA or FHA approval, right? We're not really seeing FHA, although they are with the same guidelines, an option to be assumable. One thing that we have seen in 2 scenarios where typically it's VA seller to VA buyer assuming it. There is an option, we've seen one before, where it's a buyer that's not a VA. In those instances, what happens to your VA seller? Their eligibility is gone. So also note that if you're accepting an offer, what is your seller's intent on ever using that VA eligibility again? Because as soon as they hand it over to a buyer that is not a VA, they will not have that VA eligibility again, but it can be done. So, right, that is an option, but just know, and I think, like Nicole said, really, as much as we can sit there and escrow, hey, assumption team, assumption team, assumption team, and I hate to put it this boldly, but there's not money to be made, right? The loan's already there.
Yeah.
There's not a new origination. There's not, new fees. So to them, it's just, kind of like you're playing ball, tossing the ball back and forth between whose court it's in. Oh, the buyer needs to do something. It sits for 3 days. The buyer is military, right? So perhaps they're on order somewhere. So these are the timelines that become where, maybe it's not, if your seller does not have time to wait, then that's the hard part. But if they do, I think it's a great option. I think those interest rates and another VA helping another VA, I think that's wonderful.
I have a question, you're probably gonna cover this,
Yeah.
but when it comes to, because of course, like when a buyer initially gets pre-approved by a lender locally, right? That lender isn't going to be the one to help that buyer get their loan assumed, right? So if they're already pre-approved, who continues that process once the offer is accepted? Is it
The
the
buyer.
bank that?
Yeah,
does
it's
that? Does that make sense?
typically what happens is if a seller wants to entertain it, the seller reaches out to whoever their servicer is and says, hey, I'm entertaining the idea of selling my house and having someone assume my loan. And then usually that assumption lender gives them an assumption packet and says, okay, this would be the process. This is what we would need. And then the agent, once an offer was accepted, would share that. And then it's kind of on, like I said, the buyers and the sellers just to constantly be checking in, like, do you need anything from me? Do you need anything from me? And we've noticed from our experience with them, a lot of these assumption lenders, they're oftentimes like, I haven't received this. I don't have this yet. And then I'm seeing emails go back where the buyer's like, I actually sent it on this day at this time. Here's my confirmation. So it's a lot of that. It's a lot of follow-up. It's a lot of saying, no, I've already done this. One of the biggest things though, that I have found that people didn't realize is you have to remember when you're assuming someone's mortgage, you're not assuming their payment, you're assuming their interest rate, which just means you're assuming their principal and interest. Taxes and insurance are different, right? So if if this buyer's buying it at a higher value than these previous owners did, their property taxes are gonna be higher. Insurance these days, their insurance is gonna be higher. So that's one thing to really remember, is that you're just assuming the principal and interest part of the payment, not the total payment. It's not apples to apples. The other things that we've kind of learned throughout this process too is that, we're used to on traditional sales that, if we close in May, the buyer's first payment isn't till July, right? They skip a month. There's no month skipped on an assumption. So let's say, for example, we're closing an escrow on May 29th. That buyer has a June 1st payment to make. There's no pay, there's nothing is skipped. And then with that being said, every time you make a mortgage payment, it covers interest from the month before. So technically, when that buyer was to make a June payment, it covers May's interest. So then you start getting into conversations. Should that interest be split between the buyer and seller, right? Because the seller owned it for a part of the time. The seller has an escrow balance that's might be existing, right, with the mortgage servicer. And we've seen a lot of these assumptions come over where they say the seller's gonna forfeit. That, even if they have $5,000-6,000 in that escrow account, it's just going to be handed over to the buyer. So what we've seen agents do is they write as part of the contract, either on an addendum or something, that the buyer and seller agree that the interest will be prorated for whatever month they'll close in, and that the buyer will also reimburse the seller for whatever escrow balance there is. Because we have had some that said, oh, we would have entertained that, but that should have been part of the original offer. So that's just advice, and it's kind of hard to know those numbers, because the other thing to factor in too is when these buyers are assuming a seller's loan, right? When you get into contract, there's a loan balance at that time. But if it takes 3 or 4 months, that seller has made 3 or 4 more payments, which now the principal balance that's being assumed is less than when they originally started, right? Yes.
And isn't it true that the buyer has to come in with the difference of
Correct.
the market value and the loan amount? So the buyer, you need to make sure that your buyers have funds to
Mhm.
come up with that difference.
Right.
So if it's a loan amount of $550 and the market value is $650, you better hope that your
Right.
buyers have $100K in cash.
And in
Can that
fact,
not be financed?
No, the VA will not approve
Mm.
secondary financing on an assumption.
no, yeah, it needs to be,
So it has to
not
be-
that we've seen.
Not
We
yet.
haven't seen one that has allowed that. So yeah, your client, if you're representing the buyer, has to make up that gap, and then also factor in if 3 or 4 payments have been made, and maybe that takes that principal down by $10,000. They need to factor in for that kind of wavering amounts as well.
And I think with anything in this process, any new quirk or, rule, regulation, option that's out there, it's just doing your homework before you put your sellers on a contract to sign up for this, or your buyer. So if it's a seller, have them reach out to their servicer. If you're the listing agent, hey, what are true turnaround times for your assumption department, right? They may tell you 30, 45, 60 days, right? I don't think they want to tell people it could take up to 9 months, because that doesn't really sound beneficial to anybody that's writing an offer, a contract. And that may be to like detour more of them. I'm not sure, but we know typical loan officers can close things in 21 days around here. We've seen it happen. But in this instance, just doing the homework, finding out if they can talk to their servicer, what are they going to use as their time frame? And then does your client have that time frame? Plus maybe just factor 1 or 2 months extra, that for any unforeseen hiccups, anything that happens, what is going to happen, so that if they're purchasing forward and they need these funds, especially if they're buying in a new build, we know new builds do not care about that. That close of escrow days, that close of escrow day to new build, that's what it is. So then this assumption lender taking their time could, that could be something that changes the course of how a smooth escrow went from kind of chaotic for you and your clients.
Yeah.
What would be the benefit for a seller to do that? Like, do they get more, typically are you seeing they're getting over asking because people want the lower interest rate? Because if it's taking months and months and months,
Yeah.
and they usually want a quick close, what would be the benefit to the seller?
Sellability.
Yeah.
I think it does. It's a feature because, hey, right now, today's interest rate is this. I'm not sure what that is today, but then I have 2.25, I have 2.65.
You're opening up a platform for buyers that might not be able to afford it otherwise.
You've seen 2.25? Were they out there at one point?
At one
Yeah.
point, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
We saw like three recently, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But mine did 2.85, lost it, all the way
And-
down.
Hi, Ed. You have a VA loan, correct? So, yeah, so Ed's someone that has a VA loan. Thank you for your service. And that's a great thing. If he wanted to, if he never wanted to use his eligibility again and found a buyer that would just take it over and they're not VA, that is an option for Ed. And his interest rate would definitely in this market and these interest rates be beneficial to a buyer that opens up a pool of different buyers that can afford versus today's interest rate.
And he just said that he's correct, he's going to buy, right?
yeah.
Wow.
And I will say majority of
But
our,
the VA buyer would have to bridge that gap. and
Yes.
what that is, and
yes,
And usually they don't have a lot of
Yeah,
funds,
that's the hard
right?
part.
That is the hard part too. And then the difference like with the VA funding fee, right?
yeah,
We've
there's,
seen differences on that part too.
we've probably did about 20 assumptions, I think, with varying different lenders. And we noticed there isn't really like a consistency, like, oh, they all do it this way or that way. They all seem to be charged maybe like a $300 assumption fee. And then, I think the VA fee, I think it's 0.5%, the VA funding fee, I think is what I've seen on. But most of them that we've seen as well have been, it's a VA seller to a VA buyer. I think we've only,
One,
Kristen
I
said
think.
one. And I think in that instance, they were using like their spouse's eligibility to purchase Fords. They didn't need their eligibility. But I think the biggest takeaway is just like pack your patience and persistence, you know, and that's what you'd have to prepare your clients for, is it's definitely a long process.
And it's hard on us too, because right, you guys are our clients. We want to make you happy. We want your clients happy. But when you're like, hey, any updates? If they're not answering you and your clients, it's the same
Yeah,
response,
that's
unfortunately. I do believe in the squeaky wheel gets the oil eventually, right?
Mhm.
But these are people behind the emails also just doing what their job is, you know,
Yeah.
who the actual person is when we see the loan docs come to us is different than like the processing people up front. And anytime,
Yeah.
we do, we typically do get the good news before you guys, but you know, we've had instances where we're clear to close, we can close on this day. Or, you know, when it's been going on for 4 or 5 months, well, now I need to tell the agents, because now you got to figure out packing up and moving, right? Because you don't know when you are going to move. So
And closing does not necessarily mean what we consider closing. They consider closing oftentimes the day that everyone could sign, which isn't necessarily the day we record and close escrow. So usually those are kind of conversations that me and Kristen have when they're like, oh, we're going to be preparing documents for a closing date of May 30th. Then we're asking, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that's the day the documents can be signed? Or that's a date you think we can actually close? Because those are different things in our state. Because oftentimes these assumption servicing departments are not in California, so they don't understand the logistics of how it works here. So those, I feel like it's a lot of like, like we're clarifying and, you know, did you mean this? Is this what happens? And it's just, I think you want to make sure you have a good team too, when you have, you know, the people on the other end have to just kind of be as diligent as you are. And Brandy, did you have a question?
I did, sorry, I'm all.
No,
the way
please,
down.
that's what we're here for.
Okay, so there's a lot of talk of, basically swapping entitlements for entitlement, right? How does that work for VA?
I don't know how that works behind the scenes, but I'm presuming it's part of the assumption approval process when the buyer's getting qualified to assume the loan. They're providing all their eligibility and all their certificates and all that to be able to take it over and that loan be assigned a new eligibility.
And
But-
not all loans are like that, right? They actually have to come to some sort of agreement that they're going to, like the seller is actually gonna they're gonna get their entitlement back with the buyer assuming their loan.
If the buyer's using their own entitlement,
Right.
yes. So that's kind of conversations you'd want to have too, if you are doing a listing with a potential assumable loan, is that, I mean, unless you're in a unique situation where your seller never needs to use that entitlement again, I think those are questions you'd want to ask if someone brought you an offer or, you know, or however you can mention it, like, you know, buyer needs to be VA that can bring their own entitlement or, you know, something of the sort, because
So I
it's,
guess you're not seeing that happen. is
I only
my
had
question.
one experience where I remember that the seller was selling here in California with us and then purchasing, because he was being stationed at another base. His new purchase Ford, I believe in North Carolina, South Carolina, one of them, could not close until this one closed because that release of the eligibility would take some time. So until it recorded, maybe took like a 30-day period, he could not close on his new purchase in that new state until that happened. And so, and I don't know what goes into that time frame either, but I remember that situation where he could not close to use his own entitlement until we recorded, and then it was like, I want to say a 30-day window.
And a majority of them too on the sellers, I feel like other than that one and maybe one other, oftentimes they're not purchasing forward.
Mhm.
Or maybe they did already purchase using, you know, a
Spouses.
spouse entitlement, but it's usually not this other transaction hindering
Waiting.
on ours just because, you know, the timing is just so indefinite.
And then, sorry, my other question, so you said that a VA, they can't offer a secondary mortgage. So what if there's two VA buyers or two buyers that both have VA?
It's a good question. I don't know that answer. I think it probably just maybe depend on that particular, you know, servicer or, you know, however that initial loan was structured and maybe like what the current, equity is, you know, the difference between the sales price and what the balance is. But those would be good questions to ask. I honestly don't know. Just the ones we've seen, like, they're like no secondary financing little, you know, disclaimers that are on there.
And we've only had one assumption lender, which we're not sure why, but it's one of those and it's warranted for these conversations, right? We all know that in a traditional financing with a VA, if there's an origination fee, perhaps the buyer cannot pay these non-allowables, where then your seller may have to be paying these things. We only have had one now, it's the same lender again, where yet again, they're not letting the buyer, who's also VA, pay VA non-allowables that the seller does. The seller's also VA. We can't wrap our head around it. We have fought this behind the wall email till our heart has just been content that they're not gonna change it. So anytime we have this assumption lender, these are conversations that halfway through the escrow, they're gonna go back and say, the buyer can't pay these. So now you're back to negotiating and moving fees back to the
And
seller.
VA non-allowables are escrow fee, notary fees, courier
Courier.
fees, things like that. So, you know, if there was, you know, no credits being offered from the seller, and then all of a sudden you find out that your buyer can't pay these things, and you're going back to the seller saying, hey, can you pay, you know, $1,500, $2,000 in closing costs? And like Kristen said, it's this one particular servicer. I don't know what they're, it makes no sense to me because it has not been like this on any of the other transactions, assumable transactions we've had, but this one is just digs their heels in and just says, nope, the buyer can't pay for this. Right. Yeah.
So month-wise, so do they take over from that spot to the end, or do they start fresh from day one?
Oh, like as far as
The
like how
loan-
many
the loan.
years?
Yeah.
It starts from, how many, if you know, if you're assuming a loan that the buyer's already, or excuse me, the owner's already 5 years into a 30-year, you start on the 25th year. You're the same years in as how many ever.
You take over.
Exactly. You take over from that point. It doesn't start it over.
And on a prelim, guys, when you see it, that deed of trust stays there in the seller's name, and we record an assumption agreement. So that's good. That's one thing that you will see on a prelim. So perhaps you start to see prelims now that this whole transaction has changed. The buyer assumed it. Now that buyer is selling it. Why is there a deed of trust on here with a previous person's name? Those are going to be things. Perhaps then it was a VA assumption. That's why that deed of trust. But then further down below the deed of trust should be that assumption agreement that's telling the story in the chain of title.
And then what if that person sells it to another assumable?
You know, I've never had
We
that.
haven't had that
I wonder
experience.
how that
We
would
finished
work.
with that. We know.
I wonder how that would work.
That would take a year.
And I'm wondering if you could assume something that's already been assumed. I imagine you can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
We haven't
mean.
had that yet.
Fine.
I know. I haven't done that yet.
We do
That's
have
good.
a question in the chat.
Yeah.
From Debbie, can a hard money loan cover the gap between the loan amount and the selling price?
Oh, not that we've seen.
Or maybe not finance on the property, perhaps. Maybe it could be like
they
if
have,
they
like,
had another home
property.
they pulled money out of. But typically we have seen it says no secondary financing, which probably would also be a part.
But I don't think it hurts to ask. I mean, who knows if guidelines change or maybe servicers have different protocol, just the ones we've seen, it's everything has been like cash has been the difference.
Mhm.
So what if it's an FHA loan that's being assumed?
I don't think we've actually had an FHA
Not
assumable yet.
Mhm.
Every single one has been VA assumable,
Mhm.
all of them that we've done.
So I would imagine on that last piece that if it's not collateralized, then it should, as long as they qualify.
Right. Yeah, it's not,
It's not tied, they can't foreclose on
I
the
don't-
loan.
and we've never had on a VA assumable where they, you know, like on traditional loans where lenders will be like, hey, we want to see where this money came from for their down payment. We need to source it. We've never
No.
seen that come up where they've actually asked
Where
where
the
the
money-
money came from, as long as it wasn't like, you know, financing that was being part of our transaction. So,
And some of these servicers too, one thing, it might not make a difference because usually you're doing your signings with your client separately, but one thing that is pretty common with all of them is that on the day we get loan documents, whatever day the buyers can sign, they also at sometimes want the sellers to sign on that same day. Doesn't have to be together, but like say you have a seller out of state, right? They're in the military, so they're stationed at a different base. Buyers are here or maybe not. Wherever they are, some of them will require they sign on the same day. So then logistically, we have to figure this out because that's part of their guidelines to get the job done. So it's a lot of moving pieces. We
Yeah.
do feel at this point, having 20 under our belt, like we've seen it all, and it's like we kind of know how it goes. It's just this one lender that, you know, and especially, you know, once there's so much skin in the game, right? 2 or 3 months have gone by. If that lender's like, hey, this buyer can't pay this, we're not going to cancel a contract. You're going to have to figure it out. And it's probably going to come from your seller because that's where it can come from. But those are the things I think too, like once you're so far in, you know, the one that was 9 months that we had, if they told you on month 6, this isn't going to work out, you're probably going to try to still figure it out, right? You've 6 months have gone by for your 2 clients or, you know, each side of the party of the transaction. So I think that also, you know, makes people, whatever we have to do to get the job done, right?
yeah.
And so it's back to negotiating even that long after a contract. So again, it just goes back to communication. Proper planning prevents poor performance, but it's what we can control. And what we can control is just having conversations up front, managing people's expectations. You know, buyers, especially if it's a first-time home buyer, that's a lot for a first-time home buyer, but the end result is what we're here for, right? That, you know, them taking over, them helping another service member. We understand it, we get it. You know, no 2 escrows are ever the same. So this is just something that's new and it's in our market. Once interest rates go back down again, this will probably be gone. And, you know, then maybe in 10 years we see it again. But we always are like changing course to what the climate is in our market. And this is where we're at.
Yeah.
So we just want to be able to tell you guys to feel confident because I'll tell you on our first one, we were like, oh,
Yeah.
uncharted territory,
Yeah.
not done this before. And then another one comes, right? And they're like, okay, we kind of know what it's like. And then you get another one. It's just like your escrows and your contracts. You did one, okay, now let's do 2,
Mhm.
but they're not all the same. And just kind of learning how they change in the course of what that's going to look like for you and your clients. Tristan.
What's up?
Talking about assumptions.
Still recovering from the stairs.
And a little fun fact on assumptions too, the county doesn't charge transfer tax on the sales price. They charge it on the difference between the sales price and the assumable balance. So sometimes it's this itty bitty amount of transfer tax, you know, if someone's purchasing it for 600,000 and they're assuming a $550,000 loan, you're only paying transfer tax on 50,000, which, I mean, that's kind of cool. So if you ever see that and you're like, that transfer tax doesn't look right on my client's net sheet, it's because they charge it on the difference, the gap. Mhm.
Mhm.
Any other questions, guys?
And if you guys have one, if you have a scenario where this is coming up for you and you've not done it, please call us. Today's, you know, question and answer is not the end of, you always have us as a resource. And we might not know the answer. We might not have ever worked with that servicer, but we probably have like 8 or 9 servicers that we have handled. So it is nice to be like, okay, this is the package when it's this servicer. This is the package we know. One thing they always, some of them will have a clause that we have to put on the grant deed also. Some of them don't. We're always like, are you sure? Because this one over here did. How come you don't? But we follow rules. We take instructions in escrow.
Is there a
But-
cap?
What was that?
Is there a cap on how many you can assume? Could I go assume every loan in town? That's 2%?
No, well, because your eligibility would be assigned, if you used your eligibility and took over the
I
sellers.
wouldn't wanna do that. What if I use their eligibility?
Well, that's a
Well,
unique
you gotta-
situation. That's what we were talking about. It's a unique situation. You have to have a seller that's willing to give it up.
Right.
And the other thing is too, that seller not only has to be willing to give it up, if that buyer that assumed it and got foreclosed on their eligibility,
Right.
you know, so it's, I mean, Christian, I think
Most
we've,
of the people that are advertising assumable loans, you're saying they're only marketing to other military?
I don't know that. I don't know how they're marking, but I will say that the ideal scenario is to someone else who could use their own eligibility.
Got it.
Just because I feel like there's a little bit more risk, obviously, for a seller to allow someone to take it. I mean, one, they can't use it again until that loan's paid off. And,
Right.
you know, who knows if that loan would stick to the rest of the 30-year term and then possibly like if they stop making payments. would be the other thing too. But yeah, I think we've had one that actually,
Is there a clause that if somebody stopped making payments, they can take it back over?
I don't know. I'm not
Had that
sure.
Experience.
That would.
Yeah.
Ideal, mortgage payment for 10 years.
Yeah, right, right. Win-win.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions, guys?
No.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you guys.
Reach out if you guys have any questions.